Chapter 9, Deaf and Hard of Hearing, presents some interesting stuff because it really is two separate disabilities, and your treatments, your programming, your placements, everything you do will be so dramatically different between somebody that is completely deaf and hard of hearing. One of the things you'll find, like so many of these disabilities, is that several of these kids are up to 40% that this isn't even their primary disability, that they have other things. So it's a little hard to count them and hard to determine where they're placed, things like that. But one of the things that hopefully you'll be able to do by the end of this lecture is distinguish between those two, deaf and hard of hearing, and how it's different. Like some of the other disabilities, it really has some emotional components to it and behavioral components of kids that have hearing disabilities. So I hope this is good for you. Another low incidence disability, and at the end you'll have a good feeling for how low it is, and that is you may teach your entire career and not have anybody that's deaf in your room, and maybe not even somebody that has hearing impairments or low hearing. Chapter 9, Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Chapter 9, Deafness and Hearing Loss. And there is a difference that we'll distinguish through this. Again, the focus questions, which I have put on the web page here for you. And then they introduce us to a teacher of hard of hearing and deaf. And he has some insight. And then they talk, so just some conversation on the top of page 313. A sighted person can simulate blindness by closing his or her eyes, or having a blindfold, but it's virtually impossible for a hearing person to turn off his ears. Throughout life, all hearing animals obtain information from their world from all directions, 24 hours a day. When a twig snaps behind us, we don't have to be looking to know that we are not alone. In addition to his tremendous survival advantage, hearing plays a lead role in the natural, almost effortless manner by which most children acquire speech and language. It's interesting that survival, hearing plays this lead role in the natural. And I have a funny thing about that. Growing up on the farm, that was my dad's thing about listening to the equipment behind you. That when I was about teenagers, when they first came out, what they called the sound guard cabs, where it'd be a lot quieter in the tractor than it was years earlier. And my dad's thing was you needed to leave the back window open just a touch so you could hear the machine, whether it was a haystacker or a silage cutter or whatever was behind there. And you quickly realized that there was a certain hum, certain sound to the equipment, and you could tell if something was wrong or not working properly by that sound. So that resonated with me right away when I saw this, about this role it plays in the natural. Almost that effortless manner by which most children acquire speech and language. Hearing infants as young as 1 month can discriminate speech sounds. Interesting. By the time they're 1 year old, hearing children can produce many of the sounds of their language and are speaking their first words. In contrast, for children who cannot hear speech sounds, learning a spoken language is anything but natural or effortless. And our discussion about language barriers or language disorders and stuff plays into this, why hearing is part of that. From here we go into definitions. Let me just pop here. Chapter 9, you see in my background here, I just have some sign language. And here's where we talk about this. So, in the definitions, IDEA really is the first one here to identify it. And really, this disability was when IDEA first came along. It's one of the first ones to identify. IDEA defines deafness and hearing loss as follows. Two different things. Deafness means a hearing loss that is so severe, and that is a term that you have to have in there, that a child is impaired in processing linguistic information through hearing, with or without amplification, and that adversely affects a child's educational performance. And this, like others, is the constant. It has to affect the child's educational performance. Hearing loss means a loss in hearing, whether permanent or fluctuating, can be either, but it too has to adversely affect the child's educational performance, and that's not included in the definition of deafness in this section. So this is where there might be some amplification or some altercation, something like that, some support, not to help with learning, but to help with hearing. And it has to be a point where it affects their educational performance. Most special educators distinguish between children who are deaf and those who are hard of hearing, and really are served almost completely different. A hard of hearing child and a deaf child will have completely different programming. A child who is deaf cannot use hearing to understand speech. Okay, and that's the kicker. Normal hearing generally means that a person has sufficient hearing to understand speech. Under its adequate listening conditions, a person with normal hearing can interpret speech without using any special device or technique. Even when with a hearing aid, the hearing loss is too great to allow a deaf child to understand the ears. Although most deaf people perceive some sounds through residual hearing, and I have a thing in the notes where you have to bring that in. They use vision as the primary sensory. Vision is a primary sensory mode. What's that vision? It's this. Sign language or something like that, or reading. This is where the voice to text comes in, so they can read the words, the scrolling words on a TV or something like that. Closed caption. That's that. And children who are hard of hearing can use their hearing to understand speech, generally with the help of a hearing aid of some kind. Can't hear with aids, deaf, hearing can be aided. Speech and language skills of a child who is hard of hearing, though they may be delayed or deficient, are developed mainly through the auditory channel. Deaf people who do not view themselves as many deaf people do not view themselves as disabled. They consider the hearing loss as an inappropriate and demeaning term because it suggests deficiency or pathology. Like other cultural groups, members of the deaf community have a shared common language and social practices, and that was why the School for the Deaf was in existence as long as it was, because of this cultural group of the deaf, the non-hearing. And they were very loud, even though a lot of them were deaf. I mean, those come from families too, but they were very loud and really hung on as long as they can to their closed culture. And what made it so interesting in a time of inclusion and integrating people with disabilities into the regular world as much as possible with inclusion and mainstreaming and least restrictive environment, yet we held out this separate school for this one specific disability for way, way, way longer than we should have, and created some real heartache for some. The cultural definition of hearing loss is used. Deaf is spelled with a capital D. And there's another politically correct thing you have to remember. You're talking about the deaf community, you capitalize the D, just as an uppercase letter is used to refer to the French, Japanese, or Jewish person. While person first language is an appropriate way to refer to individuals with disabilities, people identify with the deaf culture prefer terms such as teacher of the deaf, school for the deaf person. So there's a real cultural thing there that's kind of hidden. So here it is again. Here's the idea definition. This is who we listen to for the most part. Yep. Deafness is a hearing loss that's so severe that it has the difficulty processing this. And here's the word. And this is how we tell if there can be in SPED. Because you can have this, and not so much deaf, but hearing loss, and still not be in SPED. If hearing aids or cochlear implants or something like that can correct it, then SPED really doesn't become an option or a problem because of educational performance. Then hearing loss is hearing that adversely affects educational performance, but is not included under deafness. So deaf students use vision as a primary source of this. What kind of hearing did we say this? That would be number one. What did we call this? What kind of hearing? from the text. In hard of hearing, students use their hearing to understand speech with the help of a hearing aid. Many persons who are deaf do not view hearing loss as disability. And so why is that? And that's number 2. All right. And how do we hear? Audition is the sense of hearing, is a complex and not completely understood process. Okay, it's called audition. Outer ear consists of the external ear and the auditory canal. And what is that term? We'll come to that. What's that term that goes there? We see the auricle, which funnels sound waves into the auditory canal and helps distinguish the direction of the sound. And then the sound waves are slightly amplified as they move toward that tympanic membrane. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Tympanic membrane. Variation in sound pressure cause the eardrum to move in and out, and the vibrations of the bones in the middle ear transmit energy in the inner ear. The inner ear is the most critical and complex part, and that's where you can have damage and things like that. Here's what I want you to do, and this will be number 3. Number 3 is I want to make sure you have a understanding, so a definition from each of those. And I can tell you almost every one of those have some role in the test, so you'll have to have an understanding of those. And we'll get down here a little bit later. We go back to how do you hear on the decibels and hertz. Hopefully you have an understanding of hard of hearing, hearing loss, and residual hearing, how those come into play. So let me go back to the textbook here. How we hear, and it kind of goes through that same thing. And here's the residual part of it. Oh, here's the eardrum, tympanic membrane. Okay, there's the eardrum. All right. Here's that part. Here's that semicircular canals here that have balance. You know, a lot of if you're clogged up or have hearing problems, you can have some balance problems. Hence happens to older people, young kids. Balance becomes an issue right away if there's some kind of congestion, those kinds of things. But here's the ear. Remember the girl we saw in the video without ears, and this makes this really hard to hear, to come in here and bounce off of this membrane. And then the pressure on that is what signifies things here. And then these nerves really are what interpret that, take it to the brain to interpret that sound that you're hearing, like the hum of the machine behind the tractor, of if it's running properly. All right. Then the nature of the sound, and this I'll let you really drag some of this out of here, but the sound measuring units is the intensity and frequency. So 2 things, and the intensity is the decibels, and you've heard of that in terms when we talk about loud music or things like that, that they'll have this decibel. Both dimensions of sound are important in considering the needs of a child who is deaf or hard of hearing. The intensity or loudness of sound is measured in decibels. 0 decibels represents the smallest sound a person with normal hearing can perceive, and that's on the test. What is that 0 decibel? 0 decibel represents the smallest sound that normal can perceive, which is called zero hearing threshold level. It's HTL. Is the smallest sound you can hear. Or an audiometric 0. Audiometric 0. Larger decibel numbers represent increasingly louder sounds on a ratio scale in which each increment of 10 decibels is a 10-fold increase in intensity. So a low whisper 5 feet away registers about 10 decibels. Conversational speech 10 to 20 feet away ranges from 20 to 50 decibels. Traffic on a city street produces sound of about 70 decibels. And a lawnmower about 90 to 100 decibels. Sounds of 125 decibels or louder cause pain to most people. Okay, you won't remember this, but I can remember when the Minnesota Twins were in the Metrodome for the World Series back in 1991 and 87. It would get so loud in there that it would cause pain, and that would get up over 100. And they were starting to say it was equating it to a jet taking off was the sound, and it was not unusual to see people in there with earplugs along. Okay, so now you know that's what decibels. So when we get to hertz, the frequencies or the pitch is measured in cycles per second, or hertz. 1 hertz equals 1 cycle per second. Pure tones consist of one frequency only. Speech and most environmental sounds are complex tones containing different frequencies. The lowest note on a piano has a frequency of about 30 hertz. Middle C is about 250 hertz. And the highest note is about 4,000 hertz. Human hearing can detect sounds ranging from approximately 20 to 20,000. Although a person who cannot hear very low sounds, like a foghorn, or very high sounds, like a piccola, like a piccolo, may experience some inconvenience. She will encounter no significant problems in the classroom or everyday life. A person with severe hearing loss in speech range, however, is a great disadvantage in acquiring and communicating in a spoken language. Frequency range most people are hearing spoken language is 500 feet, 2,000 to 2,000 hertz. But some speech sounds have frequency below or above that range. For example, a phoneme, as in the word sat, is a high frequency sound, typically occurring between 4,000 and 8,000. A student whose hearing loss is more severe at higher frequencies will thus have particular difficulty in discriminating that as sound. Conversely, phonemes, such as the DJ, the sound of jump, and M, occur at low frequencies, will be more problematic for a student with low frequency hearing loss. As you might expect, a student with a high frequency hearing loss tends to hear men's voices more easily than women's voices. And I'll give you a kick. That is on the test. Okay. But I say I want you to pick this apart about how those work, those different ratings and stuff. And so that will give you some sense, and I know we had to deal with this a little bit when we were putting a new sound system inside our house, a theater system, about this, how many decibels it could kick out and what was the range of the hertz. So we can't say we never use this because that's the questions we had to answer, and the people installing would give us different demonstrations of them. So the decibels is the intensity and loudness. 0 is a small sound you can hear. And sounds of 125 can be dangerous. Then the frequency or pitch of sound is measured in cycles per second. Pure tones consist of 1, and the frequency range is here. So that's the nature of sound. So what is the characteristics of the student with a hearing loss? Well, students who receive SPED because of hearing loss are kind of a heterogeneous, meaning different. Homogeneous being the same, these are different. Levels of functioning influenced by, first of all, the type and degree of the hearing loss and that age of the onset. Because if they had some hearing early and then lost it, they probably have developed or learned some hearing things. And this is interesting, the attitudes of parents and siblings. And then opportunities to acquire this first language and the presence or absence of other disabilities. Generalizations about how deaf people are exposed to act feel must be viewed with extreme caution. So let's go here and talk about these characteristics. Hearing should have 3 qualifications. First, students who receive SPED because of this assume commonly observed behavioral characteristics or average level or of academic achievement is representative of all children with hearing loss. Okay. So it's a mistake to assume that they're average. So that's one thing they're saying. Second, the hearing loss of child communication, language skills, academic achievement, social and emotional functioning are influenced by many factors, including type and degree and the age of onset. Opportunities to acquire first language, the presence and absence of other disabilities, and third, generalizations of how deaf people are supposed to act and feel must be viewed with extreme caution. Lane makes strong case against the existence of so-called psychology of the deaf. Notes the similarity of the traits attributed to deaf people in the professional literature of traits attributed to African people and literature of colonialism, and suggests that those traits do not reflect the characteristics of deaf people. Now, can I pick at this a little bit? I think this is a very interesting word that they put in here. Let me read this to you again. I don't get this, and it makes me question Dr. Heward here. Notes that similarity of the traits attributed to deaf people in the professional literature to traits attributed to African people in the literature of colonialism, and suggests that those traits do not reflect the characteristics of deaf people, but the paternalistic posture of the hearing experts making these attributions. Will you do me a favor? Let's do this. Let me come back here and make this, this was number 3, this is number 4 here, and we're going to put it, you put it down here. We're going to make this number 4, and this is colonialism, and what it has to do with this, why they would use that word in here. I'm not going to. I'm going to stop there. But look up the word colonialism for number 4 here, and tell me why they would include that in this discussion. It's absolutely bizarre, I think. All right, enough of that. So let's go on to this English literacy. Here's what I want you to bring in: a child with hearing loss, especially prelingual loss of 90 decibels or greater. Prelingual means before they learn language. I'd like you to add that here. This is number 5. Let's put that up here. 90 decibels. dBs or less. Put that in there so you have that. That's who we're talking about. And that's kind of the barrier, that's kind of the bar for this, for hearing loss. Okay, so they're the ones that come out of here. I'll leave that highlighted there. Greater disadvantage of acquiring English language skills. From early infancy, hearing children typically acquire a large vocabulary and knowledge of grammar and word order. Those. So I'm going to jump back over here and just show you what that looks like. They'll have smaller vocabularies than peers with normal age. They'll learn concrete words more easily than abstract words, have difficulty with function words and omit endings of words, have difficulty differentiating between questions from statements. See if you know this. Got keys or are got keys? Okay, one's a statement, one's a question. Do you remember what show that's from? That was on a show one time where they argued about how it was said. Was it said as got keys or got keys? I'm not going to make this a number, but if you remember where that is from, you can stop this now and say, what show was that from? If you ever saw that episode. Okay? But you'll have difficulty understanding and writing sentences with passive voice or relative clause, and may have atypical speech that are unable to monitor their own speech. Okay, and that comes from this. The speech is, down here, they may speak too loudly or not loud enough because they have a hard time monitoring if they don't hear. So here's what I'd like you to do, and I'm going to make this number 6, is just one line about each of these things, kind of an example. I'm just going to write that here, example. Give me an example of small vocabularies, concrete words. Because the text does that here. The text gives you each of that, something to say about each of those. Okay. And again, make it nice and bold or red for me so I can find it. And then let's go back here to academic achievement. Students who are deaf and hard of hearing continue to lag behind their general education peers in academic achievements. Most children with hearing loss have difficulty with all areas of academic achievement, especially reading and math. Studies of the academic achievement of students in hearing loss have routinely found that they lag far behind their peers, and the gap achievement between children with normal hearing and those with hearing loss usually widens as they get older. The average deaf student who leaves high school at age 18 or 19 is reading at about a 4th grade level. So I want to bring that in here and say to that here, students with hearing loss have difficulty with all things, especially reading and math. Gap achievement children normal, and those hearing widens as they get older. And right here, this is number 7. I want you to put that statement about what their average reading scores are right here from page 317. The average deaf student who leaves high school at age 18 or 19 is reading at about the 4th grade level. So I want that right here from page 317. And then that's right below this. About 30% of deaf students leave school functionally illiterate. Now, having heard all that, this here academic performance must not be equated with intelligence. And unfortunately, we do this not only to deaf kids, but kids with other disabilities also. But deafness itself imposes no limitations on the cognitive capabilities. And some deaf students read very well and excel academically. The problem with deaf students often experience in education and as adjustment are largely attributable to inadequate development of that first language, as well as a mismatch between demands of the spoken and written English and the student's ability to understand and communicate in English. And I think we do this to kids with learning disabilities too, is their inability to read and pick up on those things we say is an intelligent thing. And so you can end up with kids that are very, very, very intelligent that are functionally illiterate. Okay, so that's what this comes. Problems attributed to this is that a problem with the first language, a mismatch between the demands of spoken and written language. Now, social functioning. We know about others, but now social functioning. Children with severe, profound hearing loss often report feeling isolated, without friends, and unhappy in school, particularly if their socialization with other children with hearing loss is limited. So here, this text is making a case for connecting them to other kids with hearing loss. I have never seen that. I've never heard that other than in the deaf community. In fact, the people that I know that I worked with that had hearing loss had the opposite. They wanted more connection with hearing people, not with hearing loss people. So I sense a bias here towards this hearing impaired culture that was so prevalent, that I think is still prevalent. These social problems appear to be more frequent in children with mild or moderate hearing loss, which is interesting, because those with severe hearing loss than those with severe loss, because they tend to not be as concerned about it. Children with hearing loss are more likely to have behavior difficulties in school and social situations than children with normal hearing. A study of more than 1,000 deaf adolescents who were considered disruptive in the classroom found that the most frequent related factor was reading ability. That is, students who were poor readers were more likely to exhibit problem behavior in school. And that's kind of profound, because that has not only follows deaf kids, that is a lot connected to all. And they're citing that here as not as deaf, but as poor readers. And the problem, of course, is kids with hearing impairments tend to fall into that category of poor readers. Yeah. Follow this up sometime and see who the children are the biggest challenge in the classroom and see what their reading level is, if their reading is behind the norm. Even a slight hearing loss can cause a child to miss important auditory information, such as the tone of the teacher's voice while telling the class to get out their spelling workbooks, which can lead to the child being considered inattentive, distractible, and my favorite word, immature. Children who are deaf frequently express feelings of depression, withdrawal, isolation, particularly those of adventitious hearing loss have that. So, yeah, I've heard that before. This depression, withdrawal, isolation, not unusual at all for kids that are deaf or very hard of hearing to have that. Okay. Before we go to prevalence, let's look at this. More likely in children with hearing loss than normal. Reports a feeling of depression, withdrawal, and isolation frequently reported by children who are deaf. Poor readers are more likely to exhibit this. To which extent a child with hearing loss successfully interacts depends on others' attitudes and the child's ability to communicate in a mutually acceptable way. And again, what I'm glad here, they didn't come back and say it depends on their ability to connect with other hearing impaired kids, because I don't think that's true. I would really like to see that literature on how they research that. This here would be that their citation. It's not cited well. Okay, so what about the prevalence? Approximately 36 million Americans report some degree of hearing loss. What do we have, like 350 million in this country? So what is that, 10%? I'm not saying deaf, say hearing loss. Here we go again. Males are more likely than females experience hearing loss. And this is very interesting. The majority of all people with hearing loss are 65 years and older, because that big group that had the birth defect that created the school for the deaf now are aging out. We had this big group that took the rubella vaccine, back 60 years, 65, 70 years ago. They're aging out now. And again, that's what happened to the school for the deaf, is the numbers just dissipated once this group moved through. About 2 to 3 out of every 1,000 children are born deaf or hard of hearing. And during the 2009 and 10 school year, 70,000 students 6 to 21, which school age, received special services in the disability category of hearing impairment. This represents 1.2%, not of all children, school-age children who receive special ed services. So this is, again, a very low incident disability, or about 1.1% of the residents of the student population. And I still think that seems high. Because I bet you didn't know any kids in your school. Certainly you didn't know any that were deaf. You may or may not have known somebody that was hard of hearing that had hearing aids. The actual number of school-age children with hearing loss in SPED programs is somewhat higher, because some children with hearing loss are counted under another primary disability, like intellectual disabilities, hence MR, multiple disabilities, or deaf-blind. It is not known precisely the percentage of these students who are deaf, hard of hearing, and here's one. A national survey of deaf, hard of hearing students found that 41% had severe or profound hearing loss, and that 40% had another disabling condition. And so I want to bring that into our adults, 65 and over. Let's put that in there. Let me see, where are we at here? We are on number 7. This is number 8. I want that in there. Males are more likely than females. And I feel like we're constantly picked on here, that if you're a male, you're likely to have some kind of problem. About 1.2 of children receive SPED services and hearing loss. About 0.1 of the residential population, student population. National survey indicated that 41% of deaf or hard of hearing had severe or profound hearing loss, and about 40% had another disabling condition. So this, I think, is important to you to know, that a lot of them now have another disabling condition. And again, realizing if their hearing impairment or hearing loss is not adversely affecting their educational performance, they don't show up on special ed roles. They don't show up an IDEA. They don't have an IEP, as we said with other disabilities. So that can skew this a little bit also. So that was prevalence. Some sign language. Learning visual phonics, how they read and stuff. This is a pretty good read here, how they teach that if you don't hear sounds. And then tips for communicating with someone who is deaf is very interesting. All right. And types of causes. Types and onset. So take a look at this. Type of hearing loss determined by the affected region of the ear. of this auditory system conductive, or is that conductive hearing impairments. This name applies and involves a problem with the conduction or transmission. Conductive hearing loss results from abnormalities or complications of the outer and inner buildup of excessive wax. Can cause this, as can a disease that leaves fluid or debris. Some children are born with incomplete or malformed auditory canals. Surgery or medic can often correct this. So you could have conductive or sensory, neutral hearing impairment can all be parts of it here. Hearing loss is the unilateral. There's prelingual hearing loss, postlingual, meaning age onset, whether a hearing loss is congenital, means present at birth, or acquired after birth, and then it's prelingual or postlingual. So let's go look at that. So there's conductive and sensory neural hearing loss. Pathway, and then mix, combination of these. This is present in only one ear, or bilaterals in both ears. Hearing loss, which can be genetic factors, maternal rubella, and that was the one that had so many kids, 60 years ago, born deaf. Congenital cymatic, whatever that is. I don't think this comes in here very good. Let's see. Let's bring this in here. Let's make that right about here. And again, I forget we're at number 9, and I want you to bring in these two things right here. This prelingual hearing loss and postlingual hearing loss. What that has to do with it. Okay, and it doesn't really talk about acquired or congenital either. So you need this whole thing here brought in to be part of this discussion. Okay, so that's number 9, and it's on page 321 here at the top, towards the top. Here's the causes. 400 causes have been identified. A national survey of more than 36,000 deaf found that causes was undetermined in 57% of the cases. Okay, one of genetic factors, about half of all congenital deafness, attributed to genetic abnormalities. More than 200 types of these are identified. Hearing loss, approximately 89% of inherited hearing loss is caused by autosomal or recessive hearing loss, whatever that is, in which both parents typically have normal hearing and carry a recessive gene. Yikes. In that case, there's 25% probability that the child will have a hearing loss. Okay. Well, that's one. And then this maternal rubella. Rubella, also known as German measles, has relatively mild symptoms that can cause deafness, visual loss, heart disorders, and a variety of other serious disabilities developed in child contracted by a pregnant woman, particularly during the first trimester. A major rubella epidemic in the United States and Canada in 63 to 65 accounted for about 50% of the students with hearing loss in SPED programs in the 70s and 80s. Since an effective vaccine was introduced in 69, the incidence of hearing loss caused by rubella has significantly decreased. And that's why they're 65 and older now. Congenitally, this one. And prematurity. And these are all, I forget how this was, they were all causes of congenital here. So here, this will be our number 10, and that is a little one line about each of these. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then also here, number 11, something about each of these. acquiring it after birth, prelingual and postlingual. Okay. And here all those are. I'll let you go ahead and pronounce some of these. I know meningitis, and I can say this one pretty good. Noise exposure. Otis media. Right. How about identification and assessment? Let me go back here and look at those. Screened by 1 month of age. For these kinds of things here. Assessment of older children and adults, a pure tone odometry, an odometer, and then speech reception test, and these kinds of things. And what I want you to do here is a little bit about each of these. Now, number 12, not what they are, but what do they do, those things. And then same down here, what do these things do for assessment? And this is more prevalent, I think, is what these mean. Some expect during baby's first year. We had a little bit of this in the speech and language thing also, is what does normal look like. But here's all these different assessments. Okay, slight, mild, moderate, severe, and profound, depending on the average hearing level across the frequencies. Figure 9.5, so that's this, and where's 9.5? Okay. And so that's what I'm going to ask you to do here is figure 9.5 here is two things. Is I want you, first of all, to recreate this graph for mild, moderate, and severe. You don't have to bring it all in, but I want you to insert a table here that and do this in your notes. You can insert a table right on the document for number 14. Insert table. And with these same columns, 1, 2, 3 columns, headed the same way. Okay, about each of those. So here's light, slight, and then mild, moderate, severe, and then profound hearing problems. Kind of hear conversational speech, those things. Okay. Then technologies that amplify and provide sound. Once assumed that were deaf simply did not hear at all, but clearly all children have some degree of residual hearing. Modern technology for amplifying and clarifying is this. Has come a long ways. So there's hearing aids and group assistive learning devices, cochlear implants, and this one's huge. I'm going to find something on that. And this is how they work. Support technology supplement replace sound, sign language interpreters, speech to text translations on our iPads, television, video, and movie closed captioning, text telephones, computer technology, alerting devices, all come into play. Hearing aids, and we'll look at these a little bit. Okay, and then educational approaches, total communication, depending on what the need is. Over the years, educational approaches. Over the years, many philosophies, theories, and specialized methods and materials have been developed for teaching children who are deaf. Most of these approaches have been enthusiastically promoted by their advocates and critically denounced by others. Indeed, for more than 100 years, people have waged an impassioned debate over how best to teach children who do not hear. Most programs for students who are deaf and hard of hearing emphasize one of three approaches: the oral approach, total communication, or bicultural approach. And then it takes us through those, what those different ones are, those different approaches. And this is a historical thing, how it was all handled. Speech reading, cued speech. And then here's the total communication approach. Here's the alphabet. Talks a little bit about the American Sign Language thing. And what about the placement of these kids? Approximately 3/4 children who are deaf or hard of hearing attend public school, and I think it's higher. In South Dakota, I know it's much higher. 60% receive most of their education in a general education classroom with hearing students. 10% attend resource rooms. Some are in severe. Some attend special schools for the deaf. And 40% of all students with hearing loss go on to college. And you remember, what's interesting here is the number of these kids that are identified as having a hearing impairment also have another disability, so it really skews these a little bit, and I think that's part of why this number is not higher, and why this is. And this one here is a mystery to me. Okay, let me just take one more peek at the textbook here. I think we kind of got it. Okay. Deafness and hard of hearing.